On a cold January evening in the early 1970s, a mother in Marietta, Georgia, stood in her kitchen preparing dinner, unaware that the next few minutes would become the darkest memory of her life. Juanita Randall had no reason to expect tragedy. Her home was peaceful, her 9-year-old daughter Debbie was cheerful as always, and the family's routine was unfolding exactly as it always did. There was nothing unusual about that Thursday, January the 13th, 1972, nothing except the way it ended. For the Randall family, life revolved around simple joys: school, chores, community, and the warm, familiar rhythm that makes a house feel safe. Debbie was the heart of that rhythm. Born on August the 21st, 1962, she was a gentle-natured third grader at Pine Forest Elementary School, a girl whose kindness made her memorable to anyone who crossed her path. Adults adored her, children gravitated toward her, and visitors to the Randall home often brought her small dolls as gifts. She kept each one carefully, as though protecting a tiny piece of every person who showed her kindness. Debbie also shared a special bond with her older brother, Marvin. He was protective, attentive, and devoted to her in the way only an older brother can be. Whatever Debbie wanted, Marvin did his best to make happen. Their sibling connection was one of laughter, imagination, and small adventures, childhood in its purest form. The Randall home sat in the city of Marietta, a community in northern Georgia known for its historic charm and close-knit neighborhoods. In the early 1970s, it was the kind of place where people left doors unlocked and trusted their children to play at the local playground without fear. With a population of around 60,000 people, Marietta felt like a town where tragedies happened somewhere else, to someone else. That illusion shattered the night Debbie disappeared. It began in the late afternoon. Debbie's father, John, was still at work. Her brother Marvin was lying down in his room, under the weather, and resting. Juanita was preparing dinner in the kitchen, listening to the soft sounds of the house, and thinking about the small list of chores she still needed to finish. Among them was picking up washing powder from the laundromat across the street, a simple errand she had forgotten earlier in the day. Debbie appeared in the doorway, dressed in play clothes, full of energy and excitement. She asked her mother if she could go meet her friends at the nearby playground. It was a short walk, barely half a block from their home, a distance she had walked countless times. Juanita agreed, but reminded her gently to stop by the laundromat on her way back and bring home the washing powder. Debbie promised she would, smiling with the bright enthusiasm that defined her. She stepped out of the house and into the cool evening air, unaware that she was taking her final steps on Earth. Juanita waited. An hour passed, then another. At first, she assumed Debbie had lost track of time while playing. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the breeze turned sharp, worry began to creep into her thoughts. She imagined the laundromat being busy, slowing Debbie down. She imagined small delays. She imagined reasons that made sense. But as daylight faded completely and her daughter still did not return, her worry grew into fear. By the time 3 hours had passed, fear became panic. Juanita went to Marvin's room and asked if he had seen his sister. He had not. When John finally walked through the door at 9:45 that night, she asked him the same question. His face fell when he said no. Their daughter, who had never once missed curfew, was nowhere to be found. The family sprang into action. Marvin, still feeling sick, could not bear to stay home. He walked the neighborhood, calling out her name, asking anyone he saw whether they had noticed Debbie. Some people mentioned seeing her head toward the playground. Others said they had waved to her earlier. But no one had seen her since. Meanwhile, her parents rushed from street to street, their hearts pounding with dread. The playground was empty. The laundromat was closed. The city seemed unnaturally quiet, as though holding its breath. Then they saw it. On the road that led back to their home, Juanita spotted a box of washing powder lying open on the ground. The box she had asked her daughter to bring home. It wasn't crushed or torn, it simply lay there, abandoned, as if dropped during a moment of sudden terror. That was when the truth hit her. Something terrible had happened, something irreversible. Choking back tears, she and John went to the police station to report Debbie missing. But because less than 24 hours had passed, the officers could not file an official report yet. Even so, they promised to help, promising they would check every lead they could, unofficial or not. What happened next proved how deeply loved Debbie was in her community. As word spread, Neighbors and strangers alike poured into the streets. Parents who had once sent their children to that same playground now walked the sidewalks with flashlights, calling out Debbie's name. College students from Southern Tech volunteered. In a matter of days, nearly 4,000 people joined the search effort, combing through forests, streams, parking lots, alleyways, anywhere a small child might be. But Debbie was nowhere. Days passed, then weeks. 16 days after she vanished, on January the 29th, 1972, a group of Southern Tech students, assisting in the search, made a grim discovery in a wooded area off Johnson Ferry Road. Hidden deep in the trees lay the body of a child. It was Debbie. She had been partially unclothed, and the injuries on her body told a horrific story, one of terror, violence, and a desperate struggle for survival. It appeared that the killer had used her own coat to silence her. She had fought as long and as hard as a 9-year-old girl could. Her family's worst nightmare had materialized. The coroner's examination confirmed that Debbie had been strangled and assaulted. Among the evidence collected was a strand of hair, one that did not belong to Debbie. In 1972, DNA technology did not exist. The hair was preserved, placed in storage, and labeled as evidence that might one day matter. But that day would not come for decades. Investigators pursued hundreds of leads. Everyone Debbie knew was questioned. Friends, neighbors, schoolmates, even distant acquaintances. But every lead collapsed into dead ends. Her killer had vanished as quickly and silently as he appeared. The case went cold. Year after year, the unanswered questions tormented the Randall family. What happened to Debbie in those missing minutes between the laundromat and the place where her body was found? Who would harm a child so gentle? And why? Those questions echoed through the decades, unanswered and heavy. But time has a way of preserving truth, even when everything else fades. Nearly 30 years after her death, in 2001, Detective Morris Nix was reviewing old cold case files when Debbie's case caught his attention. Something about it, the innocence of the victim, the lack of closure, refused to let him look away. He reopened the case. Inside the evidence box stored since 1972, he found the single preserved strand of hair. It was the only biological clue investigators had. He sent it to the FBI for testing, but early 2000s DNA technology still wasn't advanced enough to develop a full profile. The strand of hair would need more time. The case returned to cold storage. Years passed. Debbie's parents grew older. Marvin continued dreaming of justice for his sister, refusing to give up hope. But hope can be a difficult thing to hold for half a century. Then, in 2015, Detective Nix volunteered for the Cobb County Cold Case Unit. Determined to take another shot, he submitted additional evidence for new testing. Again, technology could not fully unlock the identity of the killer. But the year 2019 would change everything. A new grant provided funding for advanced DNA testing, and forensic science was evolving rapidly. The preserved hair was re-examined. A partial profile emerged, still incomplete, but promising. Investigators finally believed the case could be solved. And in the year 2023, after 51 years of waiting, the breakthrough arrived. Genetic genealogy, the same method used to solve dozens of long cold cases, was applied to Debbie's evidence. DNA Labs International developed a comprehensive SNP profile that allowed investigators to build family trees, eliminate distant matches, and trace the lineage back to one man. His name was William B. Rose, a man from Mableton, 24 years old at the time of the killing, a man who lived in the same residential area as Debbie's family, a man who had never been a suspect, a man who took his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie was murdered. Investigators contacted his living relatives. Shockingly, they agreed to provide DNA samples voluntarily. Their cooperation helped confirm the truth. The DNA taken from Debbie's clothing matched William B. Rose perfectly. He was the man who abducted her. He was the man who ended her life. And he had been hiding in plain sight, not alive, not gone, but buried. The police exhumed his body. Post-mortem DNA testing removed any doubt. Debbie's killer had finally been identified. But her parents were no longer alive to hear the news. Juanita passed away in 2018 after a long fight with leukemia. John followed in 2022. They died without ever knowing who hurt their daughter. Without answers, without closure. But Marvin, Debbie's protective older brother, the one who searched for her on that terrible night, lived to see justice delivered. When the announcement was made, he said softly, "I wish my mother was here, but I know she's in heaven now, and it's finally over." More than 50 years after the death of a 9-year-old girl, her story was no longer a mystery. Science had spoken for her when she no longer could. This is the kind of story we explore here on Disturbed Intent Cases, where innocence meets darkness, where justice sleeps for decades before waking, and where the smallest clue can change everything. Make sure you like this video, comment your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the mysteries that linger in the shadows. If there is a case you would like us to cover, drop it in the comments below. Your suggestion might be the next story we bring into the light. The discovery of Debbie's body in the woods off Johnson Ferry Road marked the end of a frantic search, but it also marked the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Marietta for generations. For the Randall family, grief came swiftly and painfully. For the investigators, frustration followed. And for the community, fear crept into places that had once felt safe. Overnight, Marietta changed. Parents held their children closer. Playgrounds emptied earlier. Front doors, once left unlocked without hesitation, were now secured before sunset. For Juanita and John, life no longer moved in a straight line. It dissolved into something heavy and unfamiliar. Oneida, who had held her daughter's dolls in her hands just days before, could now barely bring herself to touch anything in Debbie's room. Her daughter's laughter felt trapped in the walls, echoing in the quiet spaces of the house. John tried to stay strong, but even he found himself pausing at the kitchen door, half expecting to hear the cheerful footsteps that would never return. The police worked tirelessly in the days following the discovery. The wooded area where Debbie was found was combed through repeatedly. Soil samples, fibers, clothing fragments, everything that could hold meaning was collected. Investigators traced Debbie's known movements, from the moment she left her house to the moment her mother saw the abandoned washing powder on the ground. Yet every connection they tried to make dissolved into uncertainty. It baffled them. Debbie had only walked a short distance. She was familiar with the area. The playground was close enough that Oneita could almost see it from the porch. How could a 9-year-old child vanish in such a small window of time, in a neighborhood full of people who adored her? Witnesses remembered seeing Debbie at the playground briefly. She played with friends, laughed, ran, and then left to complete her errand at the laundromat. The owner confirmed that she picked up the washing powder exactly as her mother asked, and then nothing. She walked out of the laundromat and disappeared, swallowed by a moment no one saw. Investigators believe the abduction occurred within minutes. A car pulling up, a stranger calling her name, a split-second decision to trust someone she had perhaps seen around the neighborhood before. A sudden hand, a door slammed shut, a child silenced before she could scream. This was the theory, but theories were not answers. In 1972, investigators lacked the advanced forensic tools available today. They relied heavily on community eyewitnesses and physical evidence that was difficult to interpret. And though they had the unidentified hair from her body, the technology of the time could not extract meaningful information from it. It was evidence suspended in time, waiting for a future that did not yet exist. Weeks turned to months, months turned to years, and the trail grew colder. Every anniversary of Debbie's death brought the same ache to the Randall family. Marvin grew older, but he never let go of the image of his sister smiling up at him, asking him to play baseball with her in the yard. He remembered how he had seen the worry on his mother's face that night and knew, even at his young age, that something irreversible had happened. Marvin carried that night with him for the rest of his life. As the 1970s came to an end, the case faded from headlines. Detectives retired, new officers joined the force, and old boxes of files were moved deeper into storage rooms. For many people, life simply moved on. But the case lived on in the heart of one person, Detective Morris Nix. Even as a young officer, he had felt drawn to the cold cases that older detectives considered impossible. He believed that somewhere in those dusty files were answers waiting to be uncovered. So in the early 2000s, when he finally came across Debbie's case file again, something in him refused to let it go. When he read the original reports, details leapt out at him, not errors, but missed opportunities. The unidentified hair, carefully preserved since 1972, caught his attention most. It was the only physical evidence that could link someone directly to the crime. And although early 2000s DNA testing could not decode it, he believed that the future would. So he made a decision that changed the course of the case. He reopened it. Unsealing that box of evidence felt like opening a time capsule. Inside were photographs, handwritten reports, clothing, and the small floral fabric circle found on Debbie's body, a detail that had bothered him since he first read the file. The hair lay inside a small envelope, labeled clearly, waiting for the world to catch up to it. He sent the hair to the FBI again. The results were inconclusive. Not enough DNA, not enough clarity, not enough technology. Again, the case returned to cold storage. But Detective Nix was a patient man. In 2015, more than 4 decades after the crime, he joined the Cobb County Cold Case Unit. He carried with him not just experience, but determination. Debbie Randall's story was alive in his mind, years after the original investigators had retired or passed on. It was the one case that had never stopped whispering to him. He reopened the evidence again. Around this time, a woman named Sandra Walker came forward. Sandra had been one of the children who played with Debbie the day she disappeared. For years, she had carried memories she was too afraid to speak about. But time softens fear, and age brings courage. She told investigators that she had nearly been run over by a speeding vehicle that same evening. She remembered glancing into the truck's rearview mirror and seeing the driver staring directly at her. She remembered the cold sensation in the pit of her stomach, something instinctive and primal, telling her that the man was dangerous. She remembered hearing Debbie scream. Her testimony didn't give detectives a name, but it confirmed something they long suspected. The killer was not a stranger passing through town. He had stalked Debbie. He had waited for an opportunity. He had watched. With renewed attention came creativity. Investigators partnered with a graphic designer to recreate Debbie's final moments, using symbolism that would catch the community's attention. Freelance artist Amanda Wood crafted an emotional depiction of Debbie as a doll, with her killer portrayed as a looming shadow. The artwork was unsettling, heartbreaking, and powerful. It stirred emotions across Marietta, prompting residents old and new to examine their memories, their relationships, their suspicions. Still, no one came forward with the missing piece. In 2019, a grant from the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council funded new DNA analysis. Scientists constructed a partial profile from the floral fabric found with Debbie's body. The profile was incomplete, but it was enough to open a door that had been sealed for decades. Then, in 2023, everything changed. Genetic genealogy was now a powerful investigative tool. It had solved notorious cold cases across the nation, cases that had remained unsolved for as long or longer than Debbie's. It worked by comparing crime scene DNA to publicly available genetic databases, identifying potential relatives of the suspect rather than the suspect himself. Detective Nix and his team submitted the DNA sample to DNA Labs International. The process was delicate, intricate, and time-consuming. Genealogists built elaborate family trees, tracing connections across generations, separating unlikely matches from probable ones. Every name added to the tree was another possible clue, another path toward truth. Then the breakthrough came. The DNA traced back to a man from Mableton, Georgia. His name was William B. Rose. He had been 24 years old in 1972. He lived near the Randall family. Children in the neighborhood had seen him before. He drove a truck, the same type of vehicle Sandra remembered. And though he had never been a suspect during the original investigation, he fit the behavioral pattern investigators now recognized. But there was a problem. William Rose had died in 1974. He had taken his own life. 2 years after Debbie's murder, Rose had a criminal record not for violent offenses, but for minor alcohol-related incidents. Yet one detail stood out. During an earlier arrest, he had expressed overwhelming fear that he would be blamed for something worse someday. He told someone close to him that he felt as though the police were watching him. It was guilt disguised as paranoia. Or perhaps paranoia born from guilt. When investigators contacted his surviving family members, they expected resistance. Instead, they found cooperation. Every relative they reached agreed to provide DNA. They wanted the truth as much as anyone else. They wanted answers. The match was undeniable. The DNA found on Debbie's clothing matched William Rose with absolute certainty. The case, after 51 years, was finally solved. But it was bittersweet. Juanita and John had passed away without ever learning who hurt their daughter. They carried that pain with them to their graves, never knowing the truth that had finally surfaced. But Marvin knew, and when the investigators told him, his response was raw and deeply human. "I wish my mother was here," he said, "but I know she's in heaven now. It's finally over." For Marvin, justice was not about revenge. It was about recognition. It was about closure. It was about giving a voice back to the sister he had loved more than anything. The announcement rippled through Marietta. People who had long forgotten the case, or who had never known it at all, learned the name of the little girl whose disappearance had once shaken the town. They learned how she lived, how she died, and how science finally spoke for her. Debbie Randall's story is more than a cold case. It is a symbol of perseverance, of the power of community, and of how truth can survive decades of silence. And it is the kind of story we bring to life here on Disturbed Intent. When the news finally broke that Debbie's killer had been identified after more than 50 years, it sent a wave of emotion through everyone who had ever touched the case. Some were relieved, some were shocked, some were angry that the truth had taken so long to surface. But nearly everyone who heard the announcement felt the same ache, the ache of knowing the people who had waited the longest for answers were no longer alive to hear them. In the early days after Debbie's disappearance, Marietta had stood shoulder to shoulder with the Randall family. The community searched tirelessly for the little girl, hoping she was simply lost or injured, praying she would be found alive. And when her body was discovered, the grief spread beyond her family. People who had never met Debbie cried openly. Parents held their children tighter. Children were warned not to walk alone, even in daylight. The innocence of Marietta had been fractured. But as the years passed, life pushed forward. New families moved into the neighborhood. Roads changed. Buildings were torn down and rebuilt. Children grew up, graduated, married, left town. The laundromat, where Debbie had gone to buy washing powder, closed. The playground she visited that evening became a memory. Time rearranged the geography of the city, erasing the landmarks of the tragedy, but not the story itself. Debbie's family, however, remained frozen in the grief of 1972. Juanita, her mother, lived the rest of her life with a hole in her heart that nothing could fill. She was the last person to see Debbie alive. She had watched her daughter walk toward the door with excitement in her steps, unaware that those steps were leading into the arms of a predator. For decades afterward, she replayed that moment in her mind, wondering whether she could have changed the outcome. Guilt is a cruel companion, even when undeserved, and for Juanita, it never let her go. Her husband, John, carried a quiet sorrow of his own. He did not speak about it often, but he felt it every time he walked past Debbie's room, every time he looked at her school photo, every time he heard her name mentioned. He had been the one to walk through the door at 9:45 that evening, expecting to see his family together as always, only to find panic in his wife's eyes. That moment stayed with him until the end of his life. And Marvin, Debbie's older brother, became the keeper of the memory. He carried her with him through every stage of his life, from childhood to adulthood, from grief to acceptance. But acceptance never meant forgetting. It meant learning to breathe around the pain. For years after the crime, the case file went untouched. The evidence box collected dust in a storage room, but the detectives who had worked the case never forgot it. Some retired still wishing they had found the missing piece. Others passed away without seeing any resolution. And the community slowly folded the tragedy into its history. When Detective Nix reopened the case in the early 2000s, he gave it something it had not had in decades: movement, a spark of hope, a sense that time had not won. He reached out to former officers who had worked the case originally, hoping to hear insights that had never made it into the official reports. Some shared memories of the frantic manhunt. Others recalled the heartbreak of telling the Randall family the devastating news. A few had theories about suspects they had briefly considered but couldn't prove. But none of them had the one answer that mattered most. What had happened to Debbie between the laundromat and the woods? That was the question that haunted Detective Nix. It became the silent heartbeat of the investigation. He interviewed long-retired judges, prosecutors, and medical personnel who had been present during the original examination. Many remembered the shock of how violently Debbie had fought back. She was small, gentle, and only 9 years old. But she had resisted with everything she had, leaving behind injuries on her arms and evidence on her clothing. The floral fabric discovered on her body, once dismissed as an irrelevant piece of cloth, later became a key to her killer's DNA. During the renewed investigation, the cold case unit sought help from forensic experts across the state. The Sorensen Forensic Lab examined the floral cloth again, extracting a partial DNA profile that earlier technology had missed. Although incomplete, it was enough to open the door to the powerful world of genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy is one of the most revolutionary tools in modern policing. It relies not on identifying criminals directly, but on identifying their relatives, cousins, grandparents, distant connections who share fragments of DNA. From there, genealogists build sprawling family trees, eliminating branches until only one possible individual remains. It is delicate work. It is slow work. And it is one of the few methods that can bridge decades of silence. When the DNA sample from Debbie's case was analyzed using this method, it returned a list of distant genetic matches. These were not suspects, they were breadcrumbs. Each match linked to a family line, and each family line branched into dozens of individuals. The genealogists began to piece together the puzzle. They examined public records, census documents, newspaper archives, marriage records, burial plots, every available source of information. Slowly, they traced the DNA through generations, narrowing their search to a group of relatives with roots in Georgia. Names began to appear, names tied to Mableton, names tied to the exact area where Debbie had lived. One name rose to the surface: William B. Rose. At first, the investigators hesitated. Rose had never been mentioned in the original reports. He had never been interviewed. He had never been a suspect, a witness, or a person of interest. His name was a ghost in the narrative. But the DNA did not lie. Investigators dug deeper and learned that Rose had lived in the same complex as the Randall family during the early 1970s. He would have been familiar with the layout of the neighborhood. He would have known the patterns of families, the movements of children, the times when parents were home or away. He may have seen Debbie playing outside. He may have watched her walk to the playground. He may have waited for a moment when no one was looking. And he had the kind of vehicle that witnesses had described. Sandra Walker's statement became more important than ever. When she was a child, she had seen a man in a speeding truck that night. She remembered the way he stared at her in the mirror. She remembered hearing Debbie scream. Her memory, though buried beneath decades of silence, aligned with the new evidence emerging. When detectives contacted Rose's relatives, they braced themselves for resistance, but the family surprised them entirely. They welcomed the chance to provide DNA, to clear their own names, to help close a wound they never knew existed. One member of the family even shared that Rose had always lived in fear. Fear that the police were watching him, fear that he would be arrested for something, fear that something from his past would catch up to him. When he took his own life in 1974, at only 24 years old, he left behind a mystery. But his death also left behind something else. The possibility that fear had driven him to end his life before the truth came out. As more DNA from his relatives came back, the match grew stronger. And when the final test confirmed that the DNA found on Debbie's clothing belonged to Rose, investigators finally had their answer. To put all remaining doubts to rest, they exhumed his body. Post-mortem DNA testing can be delicate. Years of burial degrade genetic material, but in this case, the results were clear, absolute, undeniable. The killer had been found. The reaction among detectives was emotional. Some had spent 10, 20, even 30 years working on cold cases, hoping for breakthroughs that rarely came. To see a 51-year-old case solved felt like witnessing history. Yet the happiness was mixed with sorrow, because justice, though served, arrived too late for Debbie's parents. But it arrived in time for Marvin. When Marvin spoke publicly after the case was closed, his voice carried the weight of decades. He thanked the investigators. He thanked the genealogists. He thanked the community. And then he said something that broke hearts across the country. "I wish my mother was here, but I know she's watching from heaven, and it's finally over." It was not truly over, of course. No solved case can erase trauma. No arrest, no revelation, no DNA match can restore the years that were lost. But closure has its own kind of power. It is a quiet, healing thing. It allows the living to breathe again. In Marietta, people began to talk about Debbie once more, not as a mystery, but as a little girl whose story had finally been given an ending. Teachers shared her story with students learning about the importance of forensic science. Neighbors reflected on the innocence of the city in the early 1970s. Children who had grown up hearing whispers about the case now understood the truth. And through all of this, Debbie's memory became more vivid, not less. Her life, though short, became a lesson in persistence. Her story became a monument to the families who wait decades for answers. And her case became proof that no matter how much time passes, truth has a way of resurfacing. At Disturbed Intent, we honor these stories not to sensationalize tragedy, but to preserve the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. If you're still with us, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your engagement helps us continue to tell these difficult but important stories. And if there is a case you want us to examine next, drop it below. Your suggestion may guide us toward the next truth waiting in the dark. When the truth finally came to light, more than 5 decades after 9-year-old Debbie Randall walked out of her home with a smile on her face, the world around the case had changed dramatically. What began as a neighborhood search in 1972 ended in a laboratory, with scientists and genealogists tracing fragments of DNA across generations. The journey from heartbreak to resolution spanned half a century, yet the emotional impact felt just as powerful as it had on the night Debbie went missing. In the years between her murder and the discovery of her killer, Marietta grew and transformed. Highways expanded, new families moved in, and old buildings were replaced with new ones. Children who had once searched for Debbie grew into adults with families of their own. Some moved away, others stayed, but the memory of that little girl remained like a soft echo underneath the city's progress. For many, Debbie became a symbol of the kind of innocence that tragedy steals away. She represented every child who walked to a playground alone, every moment a parent glanced at the clock waiting for a knock at the door, every family that experienced loss without explanation. Her case became part of the quiet history of Marietta, a story that shaped the community even as time pulled people forward. By the time forensic genealogy became a tool in criminal investigations, Debbie's case had already been cold for longer than her entire lifespan. Most of the original witnesses were elderly or had passed away. Landmarks had changed so much that younger investigators had difficulty imagining what the neighborhood looked like in 1972. Even the woods where Debbie's body was found had transformed over the decades. But the truth had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. After William B. Rose was identified as the man responsible for Debbie's kidnapping and murder, investigators sought to understand how he managed to escape suspicion for so long. Rose had lived in the same general area as the Randall family. He was familiar to children in the neighborhood. He drove the kind of truck Sandra Walker remembered, and yet he had remained hidden in plain sight. Part of the mystery lay in the fact that, during the 1970s, the science of crime solving was fundamentally limited. DNA analysis did not exist. Genealogy databases were 50 years away. A strand of hair could not reveal a killer's identity. And a predator who blended into the community could walk among families without ever being questioned. Rose was 24 years old when he abducted and murdered Debbie. Witnesses later described him as quiet, serious, and somewhat solitary. No one suspected him of anything violent. He had minor run-ins with the police, but nothing that would have alarmed investigators. The idea that he was capable of harming a child had never crossed anyone's mind. Yet something dark lived beneath his surface. Relatives later revealed that Rose had suffered from overwhelming fear after his minor arrest. He expressed anxiety that police were watching him. He seemed terrified that something from his past would catch up to him. Whether this fear was related to guilt for what he had done to Debbie, or whether it stemmed from something else entirely, investigators may never know. But it painted a portrait of a man consumed by demons he could no longer conceal. When he took his own life in 1974, he left behind no confession, no explanation, and no opportunity for justice in the traditional sense. Instead, he left behind the silence of a closed grave, one investigators would eventually need to open. Exhuming a body is never a simple decision. It is a process that requires legal approval, ethical consideration, and respect for the deceased's family. But Rose's relatives, aware of the opportunity to finally bring closure to Debbie's case, offered their support. They wanted certainty. They wanted the truth to be known. And they wanted to ensure that no doubt lingered in the minds of Debbie's surviving family or the investigators who had worked for decades without answers. The DNA extracted from Rose's remains matched the crime scene DNA with absolute precision. Even after nearly 50 years underground, science was able to speak louder than silence. And with that confirmation, the story of Debbie Randall's murder finally reached its long-awaited conclusion. When the news conference was held to announce the identification of the killer, investigators spoke with a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that they could offer answers. Grief that the answers had come too late for Debbie's parents. Detective Nix, who had chased this case across decades, stood at the forefront. His voice wavered as he described the significance of the breakthrough. He had dedicated years of his life to finding justice for Debbie, and though the killer could not be arrested or tried, the truth served as its own form of justice. Reporters asked about Debbie's family, about how they handled the news. Investigators explained that both Onita and John had passed away before the case was solved. Hearing this detail caused a ripple of emotion across the room. Journalists who had covered crime for decades felt tears rise behind their eyes. Even seasoned officers swallowed hard. It was a reminder of how cruel time can be. But Marvin, Debbie's brother, was there to speak for the family. He stepped forward, quiet but composed. He thanked the investigators. He thanked the genealogists. He thanked the community. And then he said the words that have stayed with everyone who has ever heard this story. I wish my mother was here, but I know she's watching from heaven, and it's finally over. His voice cracked. Reporters lowered their cameras. Silence filled the room. It was not just the resolution of a case. It was the closing of a wound that had been open for more than half a century. After the announcement, people from across the country reached out to the Randall family, offering condolences and prayers. Many were parents who had followed the case and could not imagine losing a child. Others were survivors of violent crimes who understood the weight of unresolved tragedy. Some were strangers moved by the determination of investigators who refused to let Debbie's story be forgotten. To honor Debbie, community members organized a small memorial, placing flowers and candles near the site where she was found. Children who had never known Debbie brought dolls, symbolic gifts that echoed the affection people had once shown her during her life. The gesture was tender, heartbreaking, and deeply symbolic. At the memorial, an elderly woman stepped forward and whispered, "I always hoped we would know her story someday." And now, thanks to forensic science and relentless investigation, her story had finally been told in full. Debbie's case highlights the incredible evolution of criminal justice. When she was murdered, investigators relied on handwritten notes, eyewitness statements, and basic forensic methods. Today, DNA can outlive a killer. Genetic sequences can connect strangers across centuries. Cold cases once considered unsolvable now stand a chance of resolution. Debbie's story is not just about tragedy. It is about perseverance. It is about the unbroken will of investigators. It is about the courage of a community. And it is about the unstoppable march of science toward truth. For every cold case that remains unsolved, Debbie's case stands as a reminder that answers may still come. Loved ones may still receive closure. Justice may still be possible, even after the passage of generations. And that is one of the reasons we tell these stories here on Disturbed Intent. We shed light on the shadows. We honor the victims who can no longer speak. We explore the mysteries that linger, and we hold on to hope even when time tries to take it away. As we bring this documentary to a close, we invite you to reflect on the little girl at the center of this story. Debbie Randall was 9 years old. She loved playing baseball with her brother. She attended Pine Forest Elementary School. She had dreams and laughter and innocence. And though her life was taken from her, her story lives on. Her case is a testament to the power of not giving up. It is a reminder that justice delayed is still justice, and that every life deserves to be remembered. If you are new to the channel, take a moment to like this video, comment your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that matter, stories that give voice to the voiceless, and shine light on truths that deserve to be known. If there is a case you would like us to cover next, leave a comment below. The next mystery we explore may be the one you recommend. Until next time, This is Disturbed Intent. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, even in the darkest cases, truth has a way of rising.